Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Immaculate Heart of Mary,
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph,
Pray for us.
Saint Francis de Sales,
Pray for us.
Saint Thomas Aquinas,
Pray for us.
Saint Benedict.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So after lunch, there is free time until 2:30 when we have our last conference. During that time, confessions are possible. Confessions will be on the second floor. There's a parlor room where there's a confession. It's also a time where you can visit a bit the grounds. The St. Maximilian Kolbe Museum is on the lower level. There's a gift shop on the main floor, and of course, the primary chapel also on this level. There's a lot to see in the church, and you can also spend some time in adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament. This second conference focuses on the exercise of virtue. Virtue is a term that we have heard, but it is not a concept which is often spoken of today. Today we speak more often of people as being kind, nice, or being good, passionate, and so forth, which are not bad things. But very rarely do we hear people being spoken of as virtuous. And if we are told that someone is virtuous, what does virtuous really mean? Our society has really lost this concept of virtue, the concept which is essential for traditional Christian thinking and traditional Catholic morals. And this concept, which our society has lost, has certainly been Christianized, has been taken by the church and supernaturalized by grace. It has been elevated by grace, but it is in fact a natural concept which even the pagan philosophers spoke of. Virtue is a lost concept in today's society because society really looks down on virtues, generally speaking. People who are virtuous are rather termed as excessive, too conservative, or self-righteous. And they have replaced this concept of virtue with some sort of vague idea of kindness, goodwill, or even tolerance, which at the end of the day can only be considered artificial, superficial, and empty. These concepts in today's society lead to nothing more than a show of kindness which accepts everyone as they are, even if this means overlooking or, worse, condoning their sinful behaviors and bad habits. Virtue is much more than these vague ideas. It is a central tenet of Catholic moral teaching and something that all Christians must practice. But in particular, we ought to practice virtue if we aspire to serve God devoutly. So, before we look more closely into the concept of virtue itself, we ought to consider a bit what devotion really means. The goal of this retreat and all of our spiritual exercises is, in a certain way, to help us form the resolution to embrace a more devout life. Prayer and sacraments, which we covered in our first conference, are necessary in order to grow in devotion. Virtues also are necessary to grow in devotion, and therefore it is very useful to explain with precision what we mean by the term devotion, the term being intimately linked with the concept of charity. In his first epistle, St. John says that he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is charity. And St. Paul says in his epistle to the Romans that the charity of God is poured forth in our hearts by the Holy Ghost who is given to us. So primordially, charity is God himself. God who loves himself eternally in the three persons of the Blessed Trinity, and who, in the superabundance of his love, communicates himself to creatures for his greater glory. The charity of God, as St. Paul put it, is poured forth in our hearts by the Holy Ghost. This is a reference to the gift of sanctifying grace, which we receive by baptism, and which is a supernatural quality which is given to our soul that makes it participate in the divine life of God himself. So you remember the fruits of the redemption, won for us on the cross, are applied to us principally by the sacraments, and first of all by baptism, which gives us sanctifying grace, which is a form of charity. It is what God gives us to give us supernatural life in union with him, a quality of the soul that makes us really participate, even here below, in the life of the Blessed Trinity. The soul is thereby given supernatural life, to which are attached other supernatural gifts which fortify the intellectual and voluntary powers of our soul. These gifts are, first of all, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So charity is, first of all, in the primary sense of the term, God himself. And then, insofar as God gives himself to us, charity may be referred to as sanctifying grace. And lastly, charity is that virtue, supernatural virtue, which permits our will to love God above all things, and our neighbor as ourselves in the love of God. So this charity is the gauge of supernatural life. It is charity which establishes our orientation towards God. And so when we sin mortally and we lose charity, it is because by mortal sin we have an inordinate orientation towards the creature, which results in our turning ourselves away from God. So our holiness is really based on charity. We are as holy as we are charitable, because charity is what is termed the queen of virtues, meaning that she directs all of the virtues and exercises them by her influence. So, for instance, the virtue of veracity, the virtue of truthfulness, is guided by charity. So, of course, charity will lead us never to tell a lie, but charity will also lead us, under certain circumstances, not to reveal right away the whole truth, if the person is not yet willing to accept it. Also, for example, justice. Justice renders to everyone what is their due, even punishment if it is due to them, but charity tempers this justice so that it does not become excessive. This is why the spiritual life could be summed up as the quest for God by growth in charity. Devotion has nothing to do with sentimentalism, despite the common use of the term today. But it is rather the desire to love and serve God, our ultimate good, and to love and serve our neighbor for the love of him. So this is very spiritual, interior, because it concerns the desire of the soul, the will of the soul, the intention of the soul. But it is also extremely concrete because it is the development of this desire that is going to push us to make progress in the spiritual life by performing concrete acts of charity in our daily life. On a very practical level, this leads us both to consider devotion, which is a quality of charity, and by which we can therefore effectively measure the level of charity and the intensity of our spiritual life, and to consider holy zeal. Devotion is an act of religion, which is the virtue which regulates our relationship with God. St. Thomas Aquinas explains that devotion is derived from devote, the Latin devovere, meaning to vow. Wherefore, those persons are said to be devout who, in a way, devote themselves to God so as to subject themselves wholly to Him. Hence, devotion is apparently nothing else but the will to give oneself readily in things concerning the service of God. And then we have St. Francis de Sales' famous description of devotion, which he gives in his introduction to the devout life, written for laity. He describes devotion as charity, which does good carefully, frequently, and readily. When speaking of devotion, these saints refer to it in terms of attention and promptitude in God's service, joined with constancy. Practically speaking, this means doing our duties, both spiritual and material, diligently and efficiently, out of love for God. And particular attention, obviously, should be given to our religious duties. Devotion is an act of our will. And as St. Thomas Aquinas explains, every act of the will comes from some consideration, since the object of the will is something good which is understood, which is why St. Augustine says that what we will or desire comes from our intelligence, what we have understood. Consequently, meditation needs to be the cause of devotion, insofar as through meditation, man conceives the thought of surrendering himself to God's service. So this is why, in order to lead devout lives, we have to lead prayerful lives, and why some meditation or reflection from time to time is always necessary, because if we don't take time to consider and understand what is necessary to work out our salvation, we will not have this readiness and promptness to act towards the good, to perform things in God's service, to do what is necessary in order to become holy. It's the reason for moments like these retreats, a time to step back and reflect on what is really important. Devotion, we are told, is prompt. It is a readiness to do what is asked of us, even if it requires sacrifices or a little extra time on our part. And constancy is also a very important aspect of devotion, because it is relatively easy for us to give our best for a day, especially if it's a good day, but much more difficult to give our best all day, every day, in particular when things seem always the same, or when we are in a bad mood, or whatever. So there you have, in a nutshell, the concept of devotion. And as you can see, it has nothing to do with what you might call the fervent sentimentalism of a pious old lady. Rather, it is a promptitude and loving care, attention in God's service, of which we all have need. Certainly there are many pious, devout old ladies, but in itself, devotion is not this sentimental aspect which the world calls devotion. It has nothing to do with that. It is an object of our will, our desire to serve God well, prompt me, readily, and frequently. Virtues thrive in an atmosphere of devotion. And virtues are necessary for the development of devotion. The two go hand in hand and reinforce each other. So now we consider more closely the concept of virtue. By definition, virtue is essentially a good habit. A habit which is good. On the other hand, a bad habit is termed a vice, the opposite of virtue. When we say that virtue is a habit, we do not mean it in the most ordinary sense of the word, as a sort of routine, for instance. Rather here, habit refers to the disposition of our soul to action. When we are well disposed to perform good actions, then this habit is called virtue. On the other hand, if we are disposed to perform actions which are evil, sinful actions, then this bad habit is called vice. God calls men to practice virtue, and they are endowed with free will for that purpose. That is to say, men are called to develop in their souls and practice these dispositions to perform good, virtuous acts. And it should be noted that the root of the word virtue is, of course, well, for the English word virtue, the root is the Latin word virtus. But the origin of this Latin word virtus is vir, man. So in virtue, we have a concept not only of what man is called to do, to develop these good dispositions, but the concept of manliness itself is included in this concept of virtue. Therefore, virtue denotes a stable disposition within our souls to perform some type of good. We can perform sporadically virtuous acts, good acts, but in order to maintain these good dispositions, we have to perform these acts frequently. Otherwise, we still have this risk of falling into vice. If our good acts are not developed into good habits, into virtues. Actions are virtuous insofar as they form and develop these stable dispositions, therefore. And on the other hand, insofar as they are the fruit of the dispositions, once they are formed, they are also called virtuous. We must perform acts of virtue to develop the virtues in our soul. And once these virtues are in place, then they direct and command acts of virtue, which we perform much more easily and frequently. So you see the connection with devotion. Once the soul has acquired virtue, or formed the good and stable disposition, then this virtue becomes the source of our good actions and greatly facilitates their production. You know that when there is a process of canonization for a saint, they're always looking for the practice of virtue, and notably heroic virtue, as a means for assuring themselves before the canonization of the sanctity of the person in question. So this stable disposition which virtue creates in our souls is really a quality of our souls which makes us ready to do good, and therefore to serve God devoutly. As virtue is really a quality of our souls, we often say that the souls of the saints are adorned with all the virtues. God created us with the capacity to develop virtues in our souls. However, because of the fall of Adam and Eve, this capacity has been considerably weakened. Original sin, which we all inherit from our first parents, has marred our nature and downgraded its abilities, as we mentioned in the first conference. We are not completely turned towards evil because of original sin, but we are completely incapable of remaining steadfast teaching of Martin Luther was that original sin completely corrupted man. And Martin Luther, as you might know, taught that even with grace, this did not really correct man's nature. According to Lutheran theology, when we were redeemed, we were bought back, and by grace, the ugliest of our souls was simply covered up. So the soul is not really holy. The souls of the saints, according to this theology, it's just covered up so that you don't see its ugliness, which is not the Catholic teaching, which is much more positive and realistic, that the grace that comes from the cross really transforms our souls. So we don't hold to this Protestant theology that we are completely corrupted by original sin. But we do have to acknowledge that we have been severely weakened by original sin, and that without some sort of supernatural assistance, we cannot reach heaven. This is why even the pagans practiced certain virtues on a natural level. But now that we have fallen, now that we are suffering from the effects of original sin, perfect virtue requires grace, because if you are going to have perfect virtue, then you need perfect harmony in your souls. In the current state in which we live, this is impossible without charity, without grace. Only with charity can we live a virtuous life, because only charity can encompass, direct, and unite each and every one of the forces of our soul in the quest for God and His love. So that is why when we are baptized, God infused virtues into our souls. We already mentioned one of them, which is charity. But by baptism, when we become participants in divine life by the gift of sanctifying grace, God infuses not only charity, but also other dispositions or virtues necessary to lead a Christian moral life. These are the supernatural virtues which God Himself adorns our souls with. God places within us the dispositions of faith and hope and charity, which unite us to God. These are the theological virtues which are completely supernatural. There is no such thing as faith, hope, and charity among the pagans. And then He also infuses into us supernatural moral virtues, which are justice, temperance, fortitude, prudence, and all the other moral virtues, that all the other moral virtues are somehow connected to these four. These moral virtues you can find in men without grace, but only on a very limited level. So these supernatural virtues, as opposed to merely natural ones, are not created in our soul by the repetition of good acts. They are infused in our souls directly by God, but we do have to develop them. We do have to make acts of these virtues in order to maintain them in our souls, because otherwise we risk losing them, and at the same time, devotion. You can see, for instance, that the supernatural virtue of hope is lost by despair. Supernatural virtue of faith is lost by those who apostatize. And then charity is destroyed by any mortal sin. And then for those other virtues, such as justice, you see very easily how these can be marred in our souls. So having summarized what virtue is and why it is important in our Christian lives, we're in a position to approach some texts of St. Francis de Sales on virtue. In his book, The Introduction to the Devout Life, he endeavors to give souls practical guidance for advancing in virtue, especially in the context of the state of life of the layman. When St. Francis de Sales prepared this part of his introduction, he anticipated that we might ask ourselves, after having learned of the importance of practicing virtue, where should I start? We are confronted, in fact, with our many defects, which keep us from practicing virtues such as patience, meekness, mortification of the heart, humility, obedience, poverty, chastity, consideration for others, bearing with their imperfections, diligence, and holy fervor. The sheer quantity of virtues makes their practice seem, for the beginner, overwhelming. That is why St. Francis de Sales, before delving in how we can practice any one particular virtue, such as patience or fraternal charity, starts out by giving us general advice on the practice and choice of virtues. We have a duty to form our souls so as to be disposed to practice any and every virtue. And this is because the truly virtuous man is prepared to do good on every occasion and under any circumstance, even though his current circumstances may prevent him from practicing this or that particular virtue. This means that we must be ready to do what is right in any circumstance, basically. Those circumstances may not come up, practically speaking, but if they do come up, we have to be ready for them. For example, a hermit should possess that virtue which we call friendliness, just as anyone else should. However, he will rarely ever have the occasion to put it in practice, precisely because he is a hermit. In the same way, someone who is poor, materially speaking, should possess the virtue of magnificence, which regulates material spending for great projects. The poor man must be ready to practice that virtue if he ever has the means to practice it. And so in the same way, we must be prepared to practice all the virtues. However, we must understand that they are not all equally useful to us. That is why St. Francis de Sales suggests making a choice of a virtue. We simply cannot focus on each of the virtues all at once, and therefore we should choose one or two which we can focus on, and there aim our special efforts. If we do this, if we choose a virtue which we can practice, which we have the opportunity to practice, then this will naturally lead us to make progress not only in these virtues, which we have chosen, but also in all the other virtues. The reason for this is that the virtues are all interconnected amongst themselves. And therefore, if one virtue increases in us, then we will also naturally become more disposed to practice the rest. So in order to help us to choose a virtue which will be particularly beneficial for our spiritual life, St. Francis de Sales makes the following suggestions. First of all, when you are making a choice of a virtue, consider a virtue that is in conformity with your state of life. Secondly, prefer the most useful virtues to the more extravagant virtues. And finally, give pride of place to a virtue of which you recognize that you have a particular need. So we have already touched a little upon the first point, speaking of the hermit and the poor man. When seeking to practice a particular virtue, we need to choose one based on the possibilities of our state in life. If we consider the family life, for example, obedience would be a virtue which a child could make a special resolution to practice. Whereas for a father, this would not make much sense because he is the authority in the household. However, a father whose temper gets the best of him could make a special effort in the virtue of clemency, which tempers the use of punishment, ensuring that it is proportionate to the offense which is made, and that it is based on reason and not passion. So the first point that St. Francis de Sales makes is that we have to choose a virtue that will be useful to us based on our state of life. Lay people can't try to live as monks or vice versa. So we have to choose something practically that will help us. Otherwise, we will never have really an occasion to practice this virtue and or towards any good. There are also certain virtues which we should prefer because we frequently need them in our everyday life. Such virtues, says St. Francis de Sales, are patience, gentleness, temperance, modesty, and humility. So remember we mentioned that virtue contains within itself the very concept of manliness. And so here we have to see that manliness is really discipline. St. Francis de Sales mentions virtues we need every day: patience, gentleness, temperance, modesty, and humility. All of these are looked upon by the world as a sort of weakness, whereas in fact all of these virtues are a sign of manliness, of discipline. Patience doesn't mean that we are not firm, neither does gentleness, but both of these temper the passion of anger, which tends to cloud our reason. And we know that reason is what makes us men as opposed to beasts. So by practicing these virtues, we are truly practicing manliness. Temperance also. People tend to give themselves over very easily to all sorts of pleasures. And this is also a lack of use of our reason. We see that beasts give themselves over to eating or whatever sort of pleasure without any thought whatsoever. That is not befitting for man who has been given reason and can use pleasures reasonably. And then modesty, which we often use today, referring to modesty in dress, but this is only one aspect of modesty. Modesty refers in general to how we present ourselves, that we present ourselves in a dignified fashion and that we speak in a dignified fashion. And then finally, humility, which is the most difficult virtue for all of us because pride tends to creep in to everything that we do. Another point on this second counsel of St. Francis de Sales to choose a virtue that we need frequently. St. Francis de Sales says that among the virtues which do not concern our particular duty, so that was the first point, we should prefer the most excellent and not the showiest. He says, comments ordinarily seem to be greater than stars, and to our eyes take up much more space. But they are not to be compared with the stars either in greatness or in quality. And they only seem great because they are nearer to us and of a coarser substance in comparison with the stars. So also there are certain virtues which, because they are nearer to us, more perceptible, and if one may say, more material, are highly esteemed and always preferred by the common run of people. So they commonly prefer temporal almsgiving to spiritual almsgiving. The hair shirt, fasting, nakedness, discipline, and bodily mortifications, to gentleness, mildness, modesty, and other mortifications of the heart, which nevertheless are much more excellent. Choose then the best virtues and not the most esteemed, the most excellent and not the most spacious, the best and not the showiest. Now I think today that, unlike perhaps at St. Francis de Sales' time, people are not generally very given over to wearing the hair shirt, to fasting, to discipline, and to bodily mortifications. But his point is well made that all of these exterior acts of penance, all these virtues which are visible, are not more important and often less important than these more interior virtues which are often despised. Gentleness, mildness, modesty, and mortification of the heart more than of the body. Fasting is completely useless if we are not able to mortify our heart and our passions. A special effort should be made to practice the virtue which is directly opposed to a vice with which we struggle in particular. So this is the third counsel of St. Francis de Sales in choosing a virtue to practice. You remember that we said that virtue is a good habit. It disposes our soul to do what is right. And then on the other hand, vice, a bad habit, it disposes our soul to a sin. And just as virtue always has a particular object, such as faith or hope, charity, temperance, justice, all of these are looking at a different aspect of our moral life. So the vices are always opposed to some aspect of our moral life. Obviously, anger is opposed to patience, lust is opposed to chastity, and so forth. And so we will all notice that in some particular area of our moral life, we struggle in particular. There is a certain vice which, if it is not anchored in our souls, it is at least an area where we struggle more. As you've seen, every vice is directly opposed to a certain virtue. So if we recognize that we are struggling with a particular vice, then it only makes sense to make a special effort to practice that virtue which is opposed to that vice. St. Francis de Sales says that if I am assailed by pride or by anger, I must in everything incline and bend myself towards the side of humility and gentleness. And I must make any other exercises of prayer, of the sacraments, of prudence, of constancy, and of sobriety subservient to the same. Now in his introduction to the devout life, St. Francis de Sales gives many counsels on particular virtues, and as you can see, the virtues are very diverse. He speaks of patience, of humility, which is a very far-reaching virtue. He has many chapters on humility, which is exterior, our way of presenting ourselves, interior, our way of thinking of ourselves, how humility makes us love our own objection. He speaks of gentleness towards our neighbor, gentleness towards ourselves also, how we ought to manage our affairs with care, but without eagerness or anxiety. This solicitude, this anxiety can be a vice in us. Several chapters on chastity, how poverty can be practiced in the world, advice on friendships, the exercise of exterior mortification, which is important, which Lent in particular asks us to perform, but as we've seen, it must always be united with spiritual dispositions if it is going to have an effect on our growth in holiness. He speaks of propriety and attire. Men in general do not have a difficulty with modesty in its relation to chastity, but there is also a certain propriety of attire which is for everyone, which necessitates that we present ourselves in a dignified fashion. It's not pride to present oneself in a dignified fashion, but respect for oneself as an image of God and respect for others. Speech, how to speak to God, propriety in words and of the respect which we owe to others, how to avoid rash judgments, detraction, and then he gives advice on the use of recreation, which he recommends as something virtuous, but as a means of renewing ourselves so that we can perform better the duties of our state of life. Also several counsels for married persons. So you see that there are many virtues that have to be practiced. They cover many aspects of our lives, many of which we don't really recognize, we don't pay a lot of attention to. But we see that we can pinpoint particular areas where we struggle or particular virtues that we need in our state of life, make an effort to practice those, And this effort in these particular areas will help us to grow in all the virtues. Since we can't cover all of these aspects, I've chosen just 3 to give you some important advice from St. Francis de Sales. 3 virtues which are particularly necessary for everyone, namely patience, humility, and chastity. St. Francis de Sales says, "Do not limit your patience to such or such kinds of injuries and afflictions, but extend it universally to all those which God may send you and permit to happen to you." This is something that St. Francis de Sales insists upon in all the spiritual offers, this necessity of taking well what providence sends our way, whatever it may be. There are some who are willing to suffer only those tribulations which are honorable. For example, to be wounded in battle, to be prisoners of war, to be ill-treated for religion, to be impoverished by some lawsuit in which they won their case. And these love not the tribulation, but the honor which it brings. He that is patient indeed and a true servant of God bears alike the tribulations which are accompanied with ignominy and those which are honorable. To be despised, reproved, and accused by the wicked is a pleasure to a man of courage. But when a man is reproved, accused, and ill-treated by the good, by his friends, by his relations, it is then that goodness is put to the test. I think more of the meekness with which the great St. Charles Borromeo for a long time suffered the public rebukes which a great preacher of a very austere order uttered against him in the pulpit, than of the patience with which he bore all the attacks which he received from others. For just as the stings of bees are more painful than those of flies, so the evil which we receive at the hands of good men, and the contradictions which they cause, are much harder to bear than the others. And if it happens very often that 2 good men, having both a good intention, greatly persecute and contradict one another because of the difference of their opinions, and it happens very often that 2 good men, having both a good intention, greatly persecute and contradict one another because of the difference of their opinions. And effectively, we notice that when we are ridiculed for our faith or something of this nature, we often almost have a certain satisfaction because we feel in a certain way honored to be able to suffer a bit for our Lord. And of course, to suffer for our Lord is a good thing, but are we capable, even receiving remarks or corrections or humiliations from good men and from our friends and relations, to bear those also patiently? That is the test of the virtue in our souls. St. Francis de Sales continues, "Be patient not only in regard to the substance and main part of the afflictions which befall you, but also in regard to the accessories and accidental inconveniences which are attached to them. Many would be willing to have afflictions, provided that they be not inconvenienced by them." Inconvenience is, in fact, the test for our virtue. "I should not mind," they say, "being reduced to poverty, were it not that it prevents me from helping my friends, from bringing up my children, and from living as honorably as I should like to do." And another will say, "I should not mind at all, were it not that the world will think that this has happened to me through my own fault." Another would be quite content to be slandered, and would bear it very patiently, provided that no one were to believe the slanderer. There are others who are willing enough to suffer some inconvenience from the evil, but not to have it all. They are not impatient, so they say, because they are ill, but because they have not the money to pay for the requisite attendance, or because those that are about them are inconvenienced thereby. Now I say, Philothea, that we must have patience not only to be ill, but to be ill with the illness which God wills, in the place where he wills, and amongst such persons as he wills, and so of other tribulations. So the true test of patience is to be able to accept and bear with generously any trials which God sends our way. He also says, "Complain as little as possible of the wrongs which are done to you, for it is certain that ordinarily he who complains sins. Because self-love ever makes us think the injuries greater than they really are. But above all, do not complain to such persons as are prone to wax indignant and to think evil. But if it be expedient to make a complaint to someone, either to redress the injury or to tranquilize your spirit, let it be made to such persons as are peaceable and love God. For otherwise, instead of easing your heart, they will provoke it to still greater disquietude, instead of removing the thorn which is pricking you. And they will drive it deeper into your foot. So you see, St. Francis de Sales is very practical, that we have to force ourselves to avoid complaint. But if for some reason complaint is necessary for us, at least do it in a reasonable manner. On humility, and in particular on interior humility, remembering that the interior virtues are always much more difficult for us to practice than the exterior ones. Certainly, nothing can so much humble us before the mercy of God as the multitude of his benefits, nor can anything so much humble us before his justice as the multitude of our misdeeds. Let us consider what he has done for us, and what we have done against him, and as we consider our sins in detail, let us consider also his graces in detail. We need not fear that the knowledge of what he has placed in us will puff us up, provided that we are attentive to this truth, that what is good in us is not of ourselves. Alas, do mules cease to be clumsy and malodorous beasts because they are laden with the precious and perfumed goods of the prince? What have we of good that we have not received? And if we have received it, why should we pride ourselves upon it? On the contrary, the lively consideration of the graces which we have received makes us humble, for knowledge begets acknowledgement. So you see here again the insistence of St. Francis de Sales on frequent, regular reflection on the graces we have received and on our sinfulness, because reflection is necessary in order to stir up in us the proper disposition. Also, he uses a very powerful example, which again should not be confused with Luther's idea that grace only covers our ugliness. But the point is that even our souls having been transformed by grace, there still remains a great deal of weakness and sinfulness because of our own choice. He continues, if in considering the graces which God has given us, any sort of vanity should be stirred up, the infallible remedy will be to have recourse to the consideration of our ingratitude, of our imperfections, and of our miseries. If we consider what we have done when God has not been with us, we shall realize clearly that what we do when he is with us is not of our own doing, nor of our own thinking. We shall indeed possess the good, and we shall rejoice because we possess it. But we shall give the glory to God alone, because he is the author of it. Thus the Blessed Virgin confesses that God has done great things to her, but it is only to humble herself and magnify God. My soul, she says, does magnify the Lord, because he has done great things for me. We say many a time that we are nothing, that we are misery itself, and the very offscouring of the world. But if we should be very annoyed, were we taken at our word and proclaimed to be what we are. On the contrary, we make a pretense of running away and hiding ourselves in order that men may run after us and seek us. We make a show of wishing to be the last and seated at the lower end of the table, but we only do so in order to pass more advantageously to the top. True humility makes no pretense of being humble, and scarcely ever utters words of humility. For it desires not only to hide the other virtues, but also and principally it seeks to hide itself. And if it were lawful to lie, to dissemble, or to scandalize one's neighbor, it would produce actions of arrogance and pride in order to conceal itself under these and live altogether unknown and hidden. So again, here Francis de Sales is making a hyperbole, but the point is well taken, again, that true humility is very linked with simplicity. Humility is simply to acknowledge ourselves as we are, with our weaknesses and with our good characteristics and our capacities, but realizing that these capacities and these good characteristics have come from God. And finally, before concluding, some words on the virtue of chastity. Chastity depends on the heart as its source, but it is concerned with the body as its matter, and therefore it may be lost by all the exterior senses of the body and by the thoughts and desires of the heart. It is immodesty to behold, to hear, to speak, to smell, to touch, and to think, when the heart occupies itself with them and takes pleasure in them. St. Paul says quite shortly, "Let not fornication be so much as named among you." These not only refuse to touch therein, but they shun and dislike intensely all kinds of unsavory smells which come from it. The sacred spouse in the Canticle of Canticles has hands which drip with myrrh, which is a preservative against corruption. Her lips are as a scarlet lace, a mark of the modesty of her words. Her eyes are those of a dove by reason of their clearness. Her ears have earrings of gold, a token of purity. Her nose is likened to the cedars of Libanus, an incorruptible wood. Such ought the devout soul to be, chaste, clean, and modest, in hands, in lips, in ears, in eyes, and in all of her body. So this refers again back to what St. Francis de Sales says also about propriety in dress. It's not only modesty in dress, but also to carry oneself in a dignified manner and in a chaste manner. He notes, as you notice, that chastity is something that concerns our whole being. The heart is its source. There's an old saying from the saints that for the pure, everything is pure, which of course does not make pure all the impurity in the world that we see today. But what it means is that the pure man has a pure outlook on things and a pure perspective on things which animates his whole being. And so this purity of the heart then teaches the body to act in a pure manner. Because purity, as St. Francis de Sales insists, is something that concerns our whole body and can be lost by any of the exterior senses. It says it is a modesty to behold, to hear, to speak, to smell, and to touch impure things. So we recognize in the world today how often and how easy it is to find things of sight which are impure. And so we have to have a great reserve with our eyes in the world today, and certainly the great resolution never to seek out these impure images. That's very necessary, and when we confess, we have with our sorrow the resolution to avoid the near occasions of sin. So when we resolve that, we resolve to avoid those occasions which always, or nearly always, lead us into a particular sin. So that requires a great discipline and a lot of virtue and manliness. As we've seen, all of this is linked together. That is essential, but do not forget that chastity concerns what we choose to listen to, what we choose to say, to smell, and to touch. So really, chastity has to come from the heart, and in this month of St. Joseph, it's a good month to pray more often to St. Joseph to develop this purity of heart, which makes all things pure, as the saints say, which gives us a pure outlook our considerations of St. Francis de Sales, for the most part, on the practice of virtue, which is necessary for each of us. We've ended 5 minutes early, so you have 20 minutes now before lunch, some time for reflection and prayer.